This is the first episode in a two-part series, and the second case in our season covering cases in Georgia, Illinois, and Montana. This series discusses historic homophobia, violence, exhumation, crime scenes, murder, and the crimes of John Wayne Gacy. Listener discretion is advised. This is The Fall Line. Thursday, November 20th, 1975. It was a cool, dry day in Chicago, and just a week before Thanksgiving, when the streets would be crowded with parade floats and revelers. 22-year-old Roger Aguirre, he hadn't spent many holidays in Illinois. Though he was born in the city, his mother hadn't stayed there long. Roger was surrendered to the custody of his father and taken to Texas to be raised by a paternal aunt. His mother had other children, his half-siblings, who lived in Alabama. They never got to meet their new baby brother. Not then. But then in 1972 or in 1973, his older sister Carol, she can't quite remember the year, Roger took a Greyhound bus from San Antonio to Chicago. After years of trying, Carol had finally tracked him down. Carol explained that, quote, back then, the Chicago Sun-Times and the Chicago Tribune newspapers had this series where you could write in and ask them for help, like in finding people. I always wanted to look for my brother, but I had no idea how to go about it. And then it was either 1972 or 1973. I believe it was 73. I got the idea to write and to tell them my story about Roger. They got in touch with him somehow and forwarded, I think, my letter to him. So, Roger had come to live with her. Their mother and grandmother were also in Chicago by then. But Roger, he was there to be with Carol and to finally live in a big city. He found a job at Commercial Solvents on Fullerton Street and saved money and made friends, especially a person named Ernest. They found bars and clubs that felt safe around Newtown. Eventually, Roger got his own apartment on Halsted Street, then moved again to the 3000 block of West Wellington. On November 20th, Roger was on the street outside his apartment. It was definitely Roger. His own grandmother, who also lived in the building, was the one who spotted him. She did not speak to him that day. He was already engaged in conversation. Roger was chatting with a much older white man, one who was sitting inside a red car. She did not make much of it at the time. No one did. Not until it was discovered that Roger had gone missing. When no one had heard from him for a few days, family members went to Roger's apartment and discovered that the lights had been left on. So was the TV. It was as if he'd just stepped out of the room. None of Roger's things were missing, not that they could tell. There was no sign of a struggle or a break-in. Roger had not left a note, and he hadn't called. Carol went to the police. They filed a missing persons report at the Chicago police station on Belmont and Western Avenue. There, she described her brother. Hispanic male, between 5'9" to 5'11", with black hair and brown eyes, and a medium complexion. There is no news coverage to mark Roger's disappearance. There never was for most of the boys and young men who went missing in and around Cook County in the mid to late 70s, especially if they hung around Newtown. Roger Aguirre's sister Carol had tried to find her baby brother for decades, only to lose him again in 1975, and only after 2 or so years of reconnection. And though she filed 2 separate missing persons reports, his case might have never been investigated, might never have even made it to the public eye, but for 2 connections, a genealogy test that brought her more family, and a possible link to one of the most infamous serial killers in United States history. Becky Wakefield is one of those relatives that found Carol. And without her research skills and determination, we would have never heard Roger's story. I first met Becky this past summer, though we'd spoken in the past. She's a longtime listener of The Fall Line, and she's also a devoted genealogist and researcher who's dug into her own family tree so thoroughly that she had enough material to put together a book. Becky says that when she finds a rabbit hole, she can't help but head down. That's a lucky thing. Her determination has led to much of what we know about Roger's case. Becky says that she's always had a need to know, to uncover things.
I was not a Nancy Drew reader, but when I was growing up, there was a young girl named Trixie Belden, and there were Trixie Belden books, and she always solved this thing, and I wanted to buy every one. And as I grew older, I work at UAB, and so I enjoy the research aspect of looking into things, and trying to understand. My cousins and I, in about 2016, we attended a family funeral. And after the funeral, all the cousins got together and we all talked. None of our parents would say anything about their childhood. They would shut us all down. We all thought that we knew who our grandfather was. But as we sat down, different people knew different things. And so we came to the conclusion that no, not all of us had the same grandfather. And so that got me into genealogy. And so I thought, well, let me research and figure out what our parents went through, because they were raised during the Depression. The father wasn't around, and the mother died in 1945. My mother would have been 11 at the time. But anyway, I got into genealogy. I did the Ancestry DNA test to try and determine our family history. And I had been talking to my cousin Cindy, and I said, will you take it? Because it may show something, you may bring something into the picture. And so she did. And in 2018, she was contacted by Carol Erickson. And Carol said, I think we are half sisters. So, that's a bombshell. And so in January of 2019, Carol went to Florida with several of her daughters, and Cindy went to Florida with her husband and her other sister, and they met for the first time. Cindy said it was a connection automatically. Then in March of 2019, Carol came to Cindy's home, and all of our side of the extended family came and met Carol for the first time. And, sometimes when you find out about a relative that you didn't know you had, it's not a good situation. But this was like perfect from the get-go. Everybody embraced Carol. Carol has 12 daughters. And so she brings a lot to the table with relatives. And so the interesting thing about it is that Carol had been searching all her life for her father. She did not know who her father was, and her mother did not know who her father was. And so by connecting, she finally learned at the age of 74 who her father was. And her father later in life became a minister and preached. And so Cindy was able to show her videotapes and give her audio tapes. And not only did Carol know who her father was, she was able to see him and hear his voice. And that was real emotional for everybody involved, because you think about how long she's been searching. And then as we got to know Carol, she mentioned that she had a half brother who was missing. He was gay, and he frequented a lot of the places that Gacy went. As far as Carol's half brother's concerned, Roger, her mother was in Chicago. And Carol, along with her brother and sister, were raised in Alabama by the grandmother. So one day, Carol goes to the mailbox, and there's a letter from her mother. She was 8 years old at the time. And it said, you've got a baby brother. So she was all excited, and Grandma and Carol and the siblings boarded the train and they went to Chicago. By the time they got there, Mom had given the baby away to the biological father. And a lot of times I think about Roger. He's born, and within a few days, his mother gives him to his biological father to raise. His biological father goes back to Texas and gives him to his sister, Ray's sister, to raise. And I think, gosh, you couldn't help but have the feeling, well, nobody wants me. And that's so sad.
We know a little bit about Roger's early life from another half-sister, Heather. They share a father, not a mother, so she's not Carol's sister. She's their father Raymond's youngest child, and Heather was born after Roger moved to Chicago, so she never got to meet him. But based on what relatives tell her, she thinks that he attended Lanier High School in Texas. Officials, though, they have no record of Roger in their yearbooks. Unfortunately, we don't know much about what his childhood was like, but we know that when he came to Chicago to live with Carol, her husband, and their large family, they embraced him. It seemed as if he was more like a brother to her daughters. Carol had 12 of them, than like an uncle.
When Roger came to live with Carol in Chicago, I think it was 7 of her 12 daughters were living with her at the time. And so I've asked them, what do you remember? And they said, he left a mess in the sink, the typical brother things. They said, people talk about a 5 o'clock shadow. Roger didn't have a shadow. He had a full-grown beard by 5 o'clock.
There were other reasons Roger might have wanted to leave Texas and head to Chicago. Becky told us about a conversation Carol and Roger had while he was still living at Carol's apartment. It was something Carol thinks that he'd been wanting to talk about for a long time. And it seems like Carol had just been waiting for him to be ready.
And they said, when he came to live there one morning, he was sitting at the kitchen table drinking a cup of coffee. And Roger said, Carol, I've got to tell you something. And she put her hand on his shoulder and said, I already know you're gay and it doesn't matter. I love you. And she said she went to a club with him at 2626 North Halsted. And from when I looked up the bars and everything, it looks like this was the Tilt Inn or Noche de Ronda. And that was owned by a man named Frank Lopez. But, he sometimes dressed up as a woman. He had this best friend named Ernest. We've tried to get a hold of Ernest. He enjoyed dancing. I asked, did he play sports? Did he do anything? Was he artistic? Nobody seems to know. Nobody knows that side of him, I guess, other than he did like to dance. And he and Ernest went to the bars and enjoyed themselves. Ernest was not his boyfriend. It was just a good friend. When Roger moved in with Carol, he stayed with her for a period of time. And then he got a job and he moved into his own apartment. The apartment that he moved into was on the first floor of a large apartment complex in Chicago. And it was across the hall from Carol's grandmother and her uncle. And then Carol told me her mom lived on the 3rd floor of that same apartment building. And I said, were they able to reconnect? And her words were, somewhat. So I take it wasn't much of a connection and reunion.
That apartment was the one on the 3000 block of West Wellington. Roger lived alone, but had friends, especially Ernest, who may have also gone by Ernesto or Ernestine. and Carol says that he was involved in at least one serious relationship. It's been implied that the man Roger was seeing in November of 1975 was married to a woman, and according to what Carol told Becky, things ended badly between them.
He comes to Carol's apartment on the 18th, November 18th of 1975. And he's really upset because he had a boyfriend and that was coming to an end. And he was distraught. And he said, I should just throw myself into Lake Michigan or whatever. He's just really upset. And so Carol talks to him. She has to take one of her daughters to the doctor. And she said, don't move. I'm coming back. But when she got back, he was gone.
If Roger had disappeared that day, on November 18th, then it might be most reasonable to assume that he had purposefully gone missing, or even harmed himself. But Roger was seen again, 48 hours later, by someone who would definitely recognize him.
So 2 days later, on November the 20th of 1975, the grandmother sees him, and he is talking to a middle-aged man in a red car. And that is the last time anyone saw him. So now you're getting, you're in November, you're getting to Thanksgiving. Nobody's seen Roger. What happened to Roger? And so they go in his apartment. All the lights are on. The TV's on. It was like a moment in time, and he just walked out. It was as though he was going to come back. He had intentions to come back to the apartment, but something happened and he just didn't. And the family had always felt that he could have been a victim of John Wayne Gacy.
In discussions of cold cases, connections to infamous serial killers are bound to come up. The public is eager to find those threads and to trace them back. It's material that's easily researchable, and it might even lead to a resolution. But we rarely entertain these theories, because the exception is not the rule. Even a horrific, prolific murderer like John Wayne Gacy is unlikely to be responsible for a disappearance that we come across in our work for this show. So much attention has been paid to the outliers, killers like Gacy or Bundy or Dahmer, that we can forget that they are not the most likely solution to a cold case. But Roger Aguirre may be that exception. To talk about that, though, we have to cover a few things. Chicago in the 1970s, its gay community, and John Wayne Gacy's activities prior to his arrest. We do not focus on serial killers on the fall line. We prefer that they remain as anonymous as they try to make their victims. But you have to know the basics, so we can truly talk about Roger. John Wayne Gacy was a Chicago area businessman who ran a successful contracting company that took him across the state. Though married and actively involved in his local community, he was able to abuse, torture, and kill boys and young men in the Chicago area for years, apparently without attracting much attention, and he used his own property as a disposal site for their remains. Per the History Channel, he likely first committed murder in 1972. He'd been charged and convicted of rape 4 years before, but did not serve out his 10-year sentence. He used his company, where he often needed to hire short-term help, as a means to access teenage boys, and he also preyed on young men in the gay community, on runaways, and on sex workers, including minors. He was finally caught when police connected him to a missing teenager, Robert Peast. According to the History Channel, quote, on December 22, 1978, John Wayne Gacy confessed to police to killing over 24 boys and young men and burying their bodies under a suburban Chicago home. In March 1980, Gacy was convicted of 33 sex-related murders committed between 1972 and 1978 and given the death penalty. 6 years and at least 33 victims. How did he get away with it for so long? Well, we've covered this ground before in our series on the victims of Samuel Little. It's a combination of who was killed, and when, and where, and whether law enforcement was motivated to look for them. Many of the people whom Gacy killed were assumed to be runaways. Who assumed them to be runaways, though? That is a little more complex. Still, the Cook County Sheriff's Office website states, quote, "Many missing persons are never reported to police. After Gacy was arrested in December 1978, it was learned that some of his identified victims had never been reported missing by their families. Some families were estranged from their relative who was killed by Gacy, and they were unaware that their relative was missing. Also, missing persons reports from distant jurisdictions may not have found their way to investigators in Cook County, Illinois. Gacy was known to have targeted bus stations and hitchhikers, seeking victims who were traveling. In some cases, though, we know that family members insisted their loved ones were missing, but that they were classified as runaways. Some victims whose remains were recovered at Gacy's property were quickly identified. For others, it took longer. Apparently, Gacy provided law enforcement with some details, and clothing, jewelry, dental records, and dates that aligned with disappearances and construction at Gacy's home were also helpful in putting together enough information. But even now, decades after Gacy's death, there are still questions. Some think that there may even be a few victims who've never been located at all. Currently, Cook County considers there to be 5 victims of Gacy yet to be identified. They are each referred to by number. Victim 10, estimated to be a white male between 17 and 21 years old. Victim 13, a white male between 17 and 21. Victim 21, a white male between 21 and 27. Victim 26, a white male between 22 and 30, and victim 28, a white male between 14 and 18. Each victim's height estimate and possible death date range is also given on the website. But let us stress, these are just estimates. As we've discussed on this podcast many times before, biological profiles, they are not exact. A victim's ancestry, height, or age may not be precise, depending on what factors were used to create those ranges, and they can be updated with reanalysis. We say that Cook County considers there to be 5 unidentified victims, but not everyone agrees with that number. Some experts and at least one family believe there to be at least 6 Doe victims. We'll get into that later in these episodes. To explain why Roger's family believes that he could have crossed paths with John Wayne Gacy, we needed to understand more about Chicago in the late 1970s, and where Roger lived, and how Gacy moved through the city. So we consulted with author David Nelson. Nelson's book, Boys Enter the House, The Victims of John Wayne Gacy and the Lives They Left Behind, came out in 2021. Nelson, who graduated from Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism, spent time covering the war crime trials and the DNA identification process for victims of the Balkan conflicts. He's more familiar than most with large-scale identification efforts. He also lives in Chicago and spent years tracing reports of missing men and boys who disappeared in the 1970s. He's the perfect person to help us understand how all these threads might connect. Because of your research and expertise, I think you might be able to help us get a sense of the late 70s Chicago landscape. Can you tell us about a couple of key areas that are, and some that may be, important to Roger's case?
Sure. So there's a couple key neighborhoods that really figure into the John Wayne Gacy case. They're mostly on the north side. There's a neighborhood of Uptown, which doesn't really play into Roger's case all that much, but plays into the cases of several of the other victims. A neighborhood that plays more heavily into the case is actually a neighborhood called Newtown, which is today known more as Lakeview. Though the thing you learn about Chicago neighborhoods is that there's so many different names for individual neighborhoods, and even within those neighborhoods, there's particular names for smaller sections of that neighborhood that you've never even heard of. In researching this book, I found out all these different names for different neighborhoods. So within Lakeview, there was an area known as Newtown, and Newtown was sort of what we call today Boys Town, or some people call it North Olmsted. And that area back in the 70s was sort of an up and coming area for the LGBTQ plus community at the time. Mostly it was gay men and lesbians at the time. And lots of different bars and clubs were catering to individuals from that background. So that area was sort of up and coming. But ultimately, that area was also blue collar. It had the remnants of early immigration from the early 1900s. So there were German settlers still there, Swedish. That was sort of fizzling out by the 60s and 70s by the time Roger was there. But it was also just a mix of people as well. There was Mexicans, Vietnamese, all sorts of people kind of mixing into this area. So it was almost like a perfect subsection of Chicago nowadays and back then as well. It was just very unique, but also this haven for young gay men.
And that's where Roger was hanging out versus where he was living, or was he living there as well?
Roger was nearby. He was somewhere on the 3000th block of Wellington, which is really just nearby to that area, and technically in East Lakeview, as we call it back then. Lakeview is divided into West and East. I don't think a lot of people here pay attention to that, but for the historians out there, they will probably pay attention to the specifics. But that's where he was located, and that's really just a stone's throw from Halsted Street, which is where a lot of these bars were. Belmont, Broadway, a lot of these clubs were there. So could have just walked really 10 minutes to get there. It's also really close to an intersection, Clark and Diversey, which back in the day was a epicenter for male sex work. So male hustlers were standing out there at different times of day, trying to pick up clients or get picked up, I should say. And there was also an area just south of that. There was a restaurant called the Yankee Doodle Dandy, which was mostly a hamburger joint. It was a small franchise in Chicago back in the day that I don't believe exists any longer. But this was a meeting place for Johns and Chicken Hawks, as they would have called them back in the day. So male hustlers picking up their clients at that restaurant. It was just sort of an undesignated meeting area. I don't know how it came to be that it was this place that was decided as the meeting spot. Unfortunately, a lot of these boys were very young, anywhere from the age of 12, sometimes even younger, but 12 to early 20s, picking up men who would come there to pay for sex.
And based on your research, this was also an area that Gacy was known to frequent, right?
Yes, Gacy would pick up hustlers here and at another location called Bughouse Square, which is a little bit south of this area. But this was a really prominent area back in the early to late 70s. Many of the victims, the known victims of John Wayne Gacy, were actually last seen in this location. Michael Marino and Kenneth Parker were last seen at that restaurant, the Yankee Doodle Dandy. Other boys had ties to this area. Some of them were doing sex work. Some of them were just hanging out at the clubs. Some of them lived nearby as well, kind of in that general area.
And I know you won't have a precise answer to this, but when we're looking at the mid-70s, when many victims disappeared, do we have any rough sense of how often Gacy was in the city?
I am not sure, because Gacy was sort of a restless individual in general. He wasn't the kind of person that just sat back and went on vacation. From the sounds of it, he was always on the move, whether for business, sometimes for pleasure. He was just all over the map. Sometimes he would also travel to other locations in the Midwest to work on different contracting jobs. What kept him busy was his business, his contracting business, PDM. And they worked all over Chicago, all over the Midwest. Gacy was also a somewhat of an erratic driver. He would go on late night jaunts into the city. He drove very fast. His car looked like a cop's car. He had that light on it. Sometimes he posed as a police officer to pick up his victims. And so that was something that he used to maneuver around very quickly. So he was just this restless a person with easy access to different places in Chicago. So I think he was in the city probably several times a week. It's also not that far from where he lived, near the airport. So it's really just a stone's throw on the highway, especially with how Gacy drove back in the day. He was a high speed driver. So I would imagine he was here pretty frequently.
One thing we talked about when we first chatted was whether or not it would be feasible that Roger and Gacy might have crossed paths. At first, I thought about whether the victimology was there, but you pointed out there were some viable reasons that they might have had to meet, and more than one, right?
Yes, there's a couple things that really raise alarm bells for me with Roger's story. One is he was living very near that Clark and Diversey area or Newtown, where many of the other victims went missing back in the days or were last seen or had ties to. Roger was a young gay man. He was out and open with his sexuality, which was sort of brave for the early 1970s, mid 1970s. He was frequenting some of these clubs, potentially that Gacy would have been to as well. Gacy picked up a few victims from a place called Crystal's Blinkers, which no longer exists today. But in the 70s, that was a popular hangout spot. He was there. We know that Roger was also frequenting gay bars at the time. He and his sister and his friend Ernest or Ernestine would go out at night and drink at some of these places.
That's the area where Roger and his friend Ernest went out. Becky and her family, they have been desperately searching for Ernest, who again might have been known as Ernesto or Ernestine, in hopes of gaining more information. They want to know more about Roger's day-to-day life when he'd moved out on his own, but also anything that Ernest might know about those last few days in November. Who had Roger met? Did Ernest know the man in the red car? But they still have not found a trace of Ernest.
We've not been able to locate Ernest either. And this week, when I was talking to one of Carol's daughters, several of them, they couldn't understand why when Roger went missing, Ernest didn't come looking for him. Ernest had been to Carol's house. He knew where they lived. And I said, well, did you ever see or hear from Ernest again? And they said, no, not after Roger went missing. And it makes you wonder what happened to Ernest.
The bars Roger frequented and the area where he lived are not the only possible overlap that he may have had with Gacy. He also worked at a company called Commercial Solvents. As soon as Becky found that out, she began to research the business and what they produced. According to a conversation Becky had with Carol's daughter, Mary recalled that, quote, Roger loved working there and referred to himself as the secretary. He worked in the office processing and sending invoices, filing, and possibly dealt with customers on occasion.
Everyone says he worked for Commercial Solvents, so I pulled the 1975 Chicago phone book and found their address. And it was on West Fullerton. I believe it was 1817 West Fullerton. And so I sent a FOIA request to the Secretary of State of Illinois. And I said, can you tell me what they produced at that location? And they responded and said, no, we don't keep that type of information on hand. I believe it was the Chicago Historical Society sent me several articles about Commercial Solvents. And I think there was a Commercial Solvents in Terre Haute, Indiana, and they were primarily agricultural things like fertilizer, things like that. The Commercial Solvents in Chicago was partly that, but then I also read where they produced paint. And since in my mind, I'm thinking, where would Roger have crossed paths with Gacy? He was a home remodeler. Would they have crossed paths there? I did find some old newsletters that Commercial Solvents produced. And so I've got those names. And so I'm trying to go through there and see if any of them are still alive, and maybe, because when Roger worked there, he was probably about 21, 22.
Author David Nelson He also feels that that commercial solvents angle is worth exploring.
So Roger worked at a place called Commercial Solvents, and that was on Fullerton Avenue, also not far from Clark and Diversey, sort of in that general area. But Commercial Solvents apparently had something to do with chemicals and paint mixing, which absolutely could have potentially brought him into contact with Gacy, who was a contractor on paint jobs, renovation jobs. It's possible that they crossed paths through this industry as well.
We are particularly interested in speaking with anyone who may have worked at Commercial Solvents in Chicago. So if you or anyone you know were employed there, please get in touch. So here's what we know. Roger frequented the same neighborhoods as many of Gacy's victims. He lived near the area where a number of victims disappeared. He mostly fit the victim profile. He disappeared during the time frame when Gacy was active, and he worked in a business that may have brought him into contact with John Wayne Gacy. To be clear, none of that rules out a dozen other scenarios in Roger's missing persons case. We know that, for instance, he had experienced violence in Chicago before. Becky told us that Roger was jumped at least once and beaten by a group of men. His family is unsure whether he sustained broken bones from that attack, and he was also depressed after the breakup with his boyfriend. There's even the possibility that he could have had a dispute with one of his friends. Honestly, anything could have happened, but there are also reasons to at least compare Roger to the remaining unidentified Gacy victims. Becky, and especially David Nelson, have both done considerable research into how these cases were investigated and how the victims were identified. This matters for a few reasons. One being that we may be looking at inexact victim descriptions, but there's also a more concerning problem that some early identifications could, allegedly, be incorrect. If that's true, it would mean one or more victims might be matches for current missing persons. One thing that was brought to our attention is the claim that there are actually 6, not 5, remaining John Does. This is based on the alleged misidentification of one victim as 14-year-old Michael Marino, who went missing on October of 1976. According to People magazine, quote, authorities told his mother that dental records confirmed that her son Michael was the 14th of 26 victims unearthed in the crawl space beneath the Chicago home. But in the 2010s, independent DNA testing claimed to conclusively prove that victim 14 was not Sherry Marino's son Michael. When we spoke with David Nelson, we discussed this topic and the complexity of comparing missing people to the remaining unidentified victims. One thing you discussed with me are some of the complexities surrounding the unidentified victims tied to Gacy. There are officially 5 unidentified victims, but can you discuss why you don't necessarily use that same count when you discuss the case? And can you walk us through what you discovered when you were working on your book?
Sure. So as of 2024, according to Cook County Sheriff's Department, there are 5 unidentified victims of John Wayne Gacy. According to me and many others, there are 6 unidentified victims. And that goes back to a victim potentially known as Michael Marino, or body number 14. Michael Marino went missing in October 1976. I think I mentioned before, he was last seen at the Yankee Doodle Dandy restaurant just south of Clark and Diversey. He was last seen with his friend Kenneth Parker, who was 16. They were buddies, they hung out together, and they both went missing and were then identified by forensic pathologists and orthodontists in 1980. They were identified just after the trial of John Wayne Gacy ended, where he was found guilty. Now, Michael Marino's mother, Sherry Marino, always had her doubts about Michael being a victim or being body number 14 as he was buried. According to his missing persons report, she heard rumors of him being seen around the area after he went missing, I believe a family friend also claimed to have seen him sometime after. There were reports of him basically up until a year after he went missing, I think maybe even more. So there were a lot of doubts with his case. But when he was officially, quote unquote, identified as a victim, she noticed some discrepancies. She also basically had a mother's instinct, a feeling in her heart of hearts every time she went to visit his grave that it was not her son. She carried those doubts with her until 2011, when Cook County Sheriff's Department made a push to get the unidentified victims all identified. And at that time, there were 8 unidentified. They have since identified a couple others, so that count has been reduced. Sherry Marino partnered with a law firm that basically took up her case pro bono and looked into it, and also filed legal papers to get Michael Marino's remains, or the remains thought to be Michael Marino, exhumed and tested for DNA. This was a long process that got tied up in the courts, but basically the discrepancies they used to get permission to exhume were discrepancies with his teeth. So that was one discrepancy. Body number 14 also had a record of a broken collarbone. Michael, being 14 and also very close with his mother, she had no memory of any kind of injury of the sort. She didn't remember that. It's not likely that he had that injury without her knowing. There's 2 other minor discrepancies here. Is according to the DNA, body number 14 had Native American ancestry. Sherry Marino had no record or knowledge of that. Now, one last thing was the clothing that body number 14 was found in the crawl space of John Wayne Gacy's home. The clothing did not match the clothing she remembered Michael wearing on the day he went missing, and she had a good memory of that.
According to a 2016 Chicago Tribune article on the DNA results, quote, Marino's attorneys, Stephen Becker and Robert Stevenson, said the identification of all of Gacy's victims are now suspect and should be reviewed using DNA. What's more, the attorneys said that they believe Gacy committed his crimes with accomplices and that a broader investigation is warranted. This was a response from Cook County's then spokesman. Per the Tribune, the office, quote, wanted to see the lab reports to help evaluate the results. The office was not involved in the exhumation and so has concerns about the chain of custody. But it also recognizes the power of DNA and the potential for the Gacy case to take new turns. The spokesman explained, quote, we opened up this investigation with DNA, but we need to see the reports and verify a lot of different things. The testing did not stop with the victim that had previously been identified as Michael Marino. David explained to us what happened next.
So here we come to the report that body number 14 does not match Sherry Marino in any way. So just to close the loop on this, Sherry and her lawyer petitioned the court to have body number 15 exhumed. Body number 15 was identified as Kenneth Parker, or Michael Marino's friend. They went missing together in October 1976. This DNA, body number 15, did not match Sherry Marino either. So there's no chance that the bodies got mixed up. Now, one thing we don't know for certain is if body number 15 is actually Kenneth Parker, at least from a DNA perspective. It was identified back in the day through dental records as Kenneth Parker, but we don't know if by DNA it's actually Kenneth Parker. His family declined to participate in any of this. They weren't interviewed for my book or anything like that. So we don't know, but we just know that body number 15 is not Michael Marino. So based on that discrepancy, that opens up a whole can of worms for all of the identified, quote unquote, victims identified properly. Dental records can be pretty accurate. There's other facts that police use, jewelry that was found on certain bodies, timeline of when people disappeared versus when work was being done on the Gacy property. So there's other ways to sort of narrow it down to who these victims were. But DNA is always going to give you the most bang for your buck in terms of answers. And I think there's a lot of questions around all of these victims, identified and unidentified, who exactly is who. So that opens the avenue that Roger could potentially be one of these unidentified victims? Was he misidentified? I just think the patterns in his story versus all the other victims just make him such a strong candidate, unfortunately, to be a Gacy victim.
We do not have dental records for Roger or a medical history to easily match up to any of the remaining victims. When he was jumped in Chicago, he may have sustained injuries that would show up on a skeletal analysis. We have an approximation of his height, and we know his hair, his ancestry, hair color, eye color. His family thinks that he wore a ring on one finger. But even beyond that, they've offered up their DNA. That's another story altogether. David Nelson thought he had wrapped up his work on investigating the lives of Gacy's victims and his work on the remaining unidentified victims when he finished his book. But then, he told us, he heard about Roger Aguirre. When did you first learn about Roger's case?
So I saw a post on Facebook a couple years ago from Roger's half sister, Carol. She posted something in a group somewhere, and the message went missing not long after, but I took a screenshot of it, and I still have that screenshot. Back in the day, this was after my book came out, so I was kind of trying to put the Gacy case in the rearview mirror. I also didn't have a great way of getting in touch with Carol, so I sort of set it aside for the time being. However, fast forward to just this past summer, 2024, a friend of mine who is also was interviewed for the book, he noticed another message in another Facebook group somewhere about Chicago history, also asking about Roger. And there was a lot more details this time around. There was a photo with him. There was details tying him to Clark and Diversey, his age, his birthday, that whole thing. And I got really fascinated with it. I ended up finding some contact information for members of Roger's family. And from there, it sort of expanded. And now there's a sort of a group thread over email where we're kind of updating each other. There's been a lot of movement with Roger's case over the last couple months. He's been in the media a little bit more. He's now, we're talking about him on different podcasts. His name is getting out there in connection with this case potentially.
When you discovered the particulars of the investigation and his family's interaction with authorities, his physical description, what was your assessment regarding the possibility of his being one of the remaining unidentified victims?
Anytime I see a young man around this age missing anytime between 1972 and 1978, I automatically think of the Gacy case. That's not to say that other people weren't committing murders and crimes in the 1970s, especially against young men. But this case just has such a strong presence in these areas where Roger lived that it raised hairs for me. I guess it just kind of put chills down my spine when I read this case. It's those common factors: the Clark and Diversey area, the age frame. He's a little bit older for a Gacy victim. He's on the upper end, but he also looks very young. So he kind of still fits Gacy's type, for lack of a better word, of victim. And then also based on the industry too, the commercial solvents was something that really kind of caught my eye as well. I just feel that he is a victim. We also have 5, according to Cook County Sheriff's Department, 5 potential unidentified victims he could be. Some of them I think we can easily dismiss as potential matches for Roger, simply because a lot of these victims were buried together. So unfortunately, 1976, that summer, spring into fall, actually, that was Gacy's most active period. So victims are buried sort of tangled together in some places. Sets of bones are sort of together. And we know some of those victims as, one individual is Billy Carroll. He was found here. It makes sense that the victim on top of him, in between another victim, would have died in 1976. So we can sort of rule those out. However, there are 2 bodies found on the Gacy property which could be potential candidates. And one is body number 10, which was found in the crawl space. Body number 10 is off on its own. It was generally under the area of the front door of Gacy's home, but it wasn't beside any other identified victims. It wasn't in the same grave as any other identified victims. So we really don't know when that victim was placed there. Gacy couldn't offer any kind of time frame for that. And part of me does take Gacy's word for this. A lot of the identifications were based on a confession he made immediately after he was arrested. I know some people will question how I can just trust a serial killer on his word, but Gacy was very Catholic and he was burdened by these murders. And I think when he was finally caught, he saw the chance to tell police about this almost as akin to a Catholic confessional. He was unburdening himself of his sins. And so I think there's a real truthfulness to Gacy during that immediate time after his arrest, where he's telling the police where to find the bodies, who he thinks the victims are, if he remembers them, what details he can offer up. So he couldn't really offer too many details about body number 10. So it could be there as early as 1975 or as late as 1978. And even Cook County Sheriff's Department concedes that the accuracy for that date range that they have listed is inaccurate. And I think Cook County says that body number 10 could have been there anytime between March 1977 and July 1977, but we really can't know for certain. The other victim is body number 28. Body 28 was found, according to court testimony, 21 feet off the driveway in the backyard of the Gacy property. This victim was the second to last victim found. All of the bodies were mostly in the crawl space of the home. That crawl space was cleared out in December 1978 into January 1979. And then from then on out, all searches of the property were on hold for the winter to pass. That was a pretty brutal winter also. There were a couple blizzards in that winter of 1978 to 1979. So it wasn't until March of 1979 where they started really dismantling the house in full and also excavating all the other different corners of the property. And this is when they found body number 28. And body number 28 was partially wrapped in garbage bags and dry cleaner bags. And it was also found with a silver ring on one of its fingers, which investigators think means that victim was married. There was another victim that was married at the time, but most of these boys were single. There was a lot of jewelry found on many of these boys as well. So it's not 100% that this individual was married. Maybe they were just wearing a ring. We're not certain. This victim was also estimated to be between 14 and 18 because it was small in stature. Roger, according to his family members, was also small in stature. The time frame for when this body number 28, was placed, we're not sure. Gacy thinks it was there early on. There was some estimates that said that this was the second victim of his, somewhere around that time frame, but we're not really sure. We do know that there was some repaving of the driveway back in 1977. There was a barbecue pit put in the house at some point in the backyard. He was also a handyman. He was always doing stuff around the house, having his teenage employees do stuff around the house. It's possible it coincided with something along those lines. What makes it tricky, though, with Roger's case is Roger went missing in November 1975, and you're not doing a whole lot of digging on your property in November in the Midwest. So I'm not sure if the time frame fits with him, but body number 28 is also a potential possibility for Roger, and I think should be looked at kind of closely. It can't hurt to have body number 14 tested against Roger's DNA. I don't think it's Roger because there's also discrepancies with when body number 14 actually ended up in the crawl space. Now, Michael Marino went missing in 1976, but that body was possibly not placed there until a full year later. In trial testimony, and this is in my book, some other researchers have noticed this discrepancy. One of his teenage employees, who's also a possible accomplice to John Wayne Gacy, who was suspected of knowing a little bit more, he was digging in that general direction in 1977, in August 1977. And according to his testimony, he would have dug right through Michael Marino's remains, or body number 14's remains. And he has no testimony of that. But we also know that many of the trenches that were dug in Gacy's crawl space were done by his teenage employees at a specific time. He told them he was digging for pipes, and then he would then use that as graves for his victims. If Gacy's teenage employee was digging in 1977, it's likely that that would have coincided with the burial of a victim at that time as well. If he's testifying that he's digging through there yet not seeing any remains, I think that's very unusual, unless he lied. But he was very precise in his memory about it. I think he was even digging on his birthday of all days. So he would have remembered these details. And then according to that testimony, if he was digging in that direction, he would have absolutely had to have come across body number 14, which means body number 14 was potentially not there until late 1977, which would also not match Michael Marino's disappearance. So that's a long way of saying, yes, I think it should be tested against Roger, but it's also likely that body number 14 is someone else entirely, because I don't think it can be Michael Marino, and the time frame simply just doesn't fit with Roger's disappearance. Gacy didn't move bodies once they were quote unquote discarded. If they were buried, they stayed buried. If they were thrown into the river, he obviously could not have gone back to find them on his own. So those bodies stayed wherever he left them between then and when investigators finally found them.
Ruling Roger in or out as one of the remaining unidentified victims of John Wayne Gacy probably seems pretty simple, right? Becky and his family, they've been working on his case since 2019, and they are desperate to find out anything. They don't need Roger's case to fit a particular narrative, and they don't need him to be a victim of a famous serial killer. They simply need to know what happened to him. That inclusion or exclusion is an essential part of the process of resolving Roger's case. Once they have the information that they need, they can move on to the next step and the next. Despite 5 years of work, trips across the country, dozens of phone calls, DNA testing, NamUs uploads, and even a documentary podcast that seemed to point to Roger as a possible Gacy victim, those answers remain just out of reach. Next time on The Fall Line, questions about NamUs, DNA testing, and Becky's fight to have Roger's case resolved. Be sure to join us then. If you have any information regarding the disappearance of Roger Aguirre, or information that might help identify the remaining unidentified victims of John Wayne Gacy, please contact Cook County Sheriff's Office at 708-865-6244. If you are a friend of Roger's who would prefer to connect directly with his family, contact us at falllinepodcast@gmail.com, and we will get you connected. If you know of a case that should be covered on The Fall Line, there's a link to our case submission form in the show notes. Thank you for listening. The Fall Line is an independent podcast, and we appreciate listener support. It allows us to do research, obtain FOIA, pay our content advisors, and support and donate to the causes we care about. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please be sure to check your subscriptions to make sure you're set for automatic downloads so that you don't miss an episode. My book, Lay Them to Rest, which covers years of my life working on a Jane Doe case and the world of forensic scientists who resolve unidentified person cases, is out everywhere now as a hardcover, ebook, or audiobook read by me. You can order it anywhere you get books or through your local library. Find out more in the link in our show notes. If you'd like to support the show and the stories we cover, join us on Patreon or Apple Premium. 100% of our Patreon and Apple Premium earnings are supporting our Family Therapy Fund and actively paying for therapy for families who have appeared on the show. On Patreon, you can get early release, ad-free versions of our regular episodes for $5 a month. If you prefer Apple Premium, you can subscribe there as well. On Patreon, we also post occasional giveaways, updates, and blogs, which all patrons can enjoy, starting at just $1. The Fall Line is written, hosted, and researched by Laura Norton, with additional research assistance this season by Melissa Gold. Interviews by Brooke Hargrove. Produced, engineered, and scored by Maura Curry. Content advisement by Vic Kennedy and Brandy C. Williams. Special thanks to Liz Lipka, to Becky Wakefield for her incredible research, to Light the Way, and to David Nelson.